Welcome. Let's start with the audiobook. If your child is hyperactive, inattentive, impulsive, distractible, helping the ADD, attention deficit disorder, or hyperactive child, a practical program for changing your child's behavior with and without medication by Stephen, Maroney, and Robin, authors of Good Behavior. Chapter 1. My child has what? Ivan, 5 years old, is a slim, very perpetual motion machine. He hardly stands, much less sits, still for more than a few moments from the time that he rises until he finally falls asleep late in the evening. Jessie is 8. You couldn't find a little girl with a sweeter face. She is adorable, with sandy blonde hair cascading from two pigtails anchored with pink ribbons. Although rarely a troublemaker, she never finishes anything on time. Her schoolwork, her food, or getting dressed. She is a dreamer, creating castles in the sky. Cal is 15 with the body of a man, the swagger of a football player, and the interests of a teenager. If a friend simply mentions an idea, Cal is going to do it without a thought or fear. He is in the midst of any scheme. His teachers report that Cal is not an instigator but the supreme reactor. He is so impulsive that his parents worry he'll try drugs on a whim. What do these youngsters have in common? At first glance, perhaps nothing. Yet, in one major respect, they are very similar. All have difficulty controlling some aspects of their behavior. For Ivan, it is movement. He cannot sit still. Jessie, Miss Personality, to all who know her, remains a challenge to her parents and teachers. Not malicious or disrespectful, she simply never finishes anything. When it comes to Cal, the term impulsive could have been coined with him in mind. Fidgeting, restlessness, interests in everything around them, and tuning into one's own little world are behaviors common to every child at one time or another. What toddler is not a whirlwind in motion? Who has not known a teenager more fascinating by her own reveries than anything going on around her? And don't we all have to remind ourselves sometimes to think before we act or speak? Most of us learn to focus on and accommodate to the world around us. Slowly but surely, we master the rules and comply with them. What makes Ivan, Jesse, and Cal stand out so clearly among their peers is that their friends have begun to make these adjustments, but they have not. Just this issue may have brought you to this book. Your fear that your child will not learn to adapt to the world around him. Will he eventually be able to sit through a meal? Will she ever get dressed fast enough to get to school on time or hold down a job? Is he going to be a sucker for every troublemaker? Will it be a constant struggle to get my child to adulthood? We do not know. When you first heard about attention deficits or hyperactivity and thought these might apply to your child, some parents have compared their children to others for years, wondering if a lack of discipline caused their offspring to be so unruly and unreasonable. Other parents attribute their son's abundance of energy to the fact that he is a boy and do not think any more about it until the teacher calls that first time. Everyone who reads or hear this audiobook has one overriding concern: helping a child gain control over his own behavior, whether it is control over motion, mind, or impulses. Labels are important if they lead to a better understanding of your child. Even if a specific diagnosis is not appropriate, understanding attention deficits and hyperactivity may help you understand your child's problem better. In this chapter, we provide the background information that will clarify the terms that have been used to describe these problems, including the most recent attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, that is ADHD. Before we conclude the chapter, we will summarize a variety of pet theories about what causes ADHD. Then, with a common starting point, we will be ready to help you to define your child's specific problems and then help him. From BC to ADHD, the evolution of the term. Organic drivenness, fidgety fills, post-encephalitic behavior disorder, minimal brain damage (MBD), minimal brain dysfunction (MBD), hyperkinesis, hyperactivity, attention deficit disorder (ADD), attention deficit disorder with or without hyperactivity, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, that is ADHD. We do not know which term you first heard, but certainly these types of behavior problems are complicated enough without someone giving them a new name every 5 years. The word hyperactive has become so familiar that the abbreviated hyper crept into the vernacular some time ago. For the past 10 years, ADD, attention deficit disorder, has been preferred term. If you have only recently become comfortable with ADD, this may be your first introduction to ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Do not feel alone. We debated long and hard about which term to use in this book. The accepted terminology has changed rapidly during the past 50 years. Unlike the latest automobile design, the alterations are not completely frivolous, nor were they introduced to increase interest in the disorder. From hyperkinesis to hyperactivity, from attention deficit disorder to now attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, these transitions reflect an increasing understanding of this condition. Think back to your own school days. In every one of your classes, there were probably at least one person who was the class clown or the daydreamer in the corner, who was rarely able to supply the right answer and who was often in trouble. Might that child have benefited from a diagnosis that would help him teachers to work more effectively with him? Many labels are detrimental. Words like dance, lazy, and dumb always hurt, no matter who says them. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder may not roll off your tongue, but as the term leads a parent, teacher, psychologist, or physician to a better understanding of a child, it becomes less frightening and more useful. Although all times you may feel totally alone as a parent dealing with a child who has ADHD characteristics, the research literature is full of descriptions of children like yours. As early as the late 1800s and continuing to the present, there are citations about restless, impulsive, overactive children who have difficulty concentrating. From organic drivenness and post encephalitic behavior disorder to hyperkinesis and fidgety fits, there have been at least 20 names applied in the 20th century to describe children who have difficulty controlling various kinds of behaviors. Changes in terminology, though confusing to all of us, reflect the evolution of thought about the causes of this disorder and more recently the relative importance of the symptoms. A strong trend through the years has been to force a medical model on the disorder. Medical scientists begin studying the effects of brain injuries or illness on children's behavior during the 19th century. They noted that many patients who either survived an epidemic of encephalitis in the late 1800s or had head injuries with were hyperactive and had difficulty attending. Some researchers suggested that the diagnosis implying some degree of brain damage might also be a suitable explanation for children who had not been ill or hurt but who exhibited similar behaviors. Without conclusive evidence, the damage was assumed to be subtle. Although the concept of some kind of minimal brain damage persisted as an explanation for these children for this kind of behaviors well into the 1940s. The notion remained difficult to defend. Many children who sustain brain injuries do not display hyperactive behaviors, and conversely, very few hyperactive children have any evidence of structural brain damage. Still, convinced that neurological damage was the basic basis of these problems, researchers looked for soft neurological signs that could be considered evidence of brain dysfunction, too subtle to be picked up by the diagnostic equipment available at the time. After finding a number of children who had trouble with fine or gross motor skills and difficulty imitating certain body movements that are standard parts of the neurological exams, the researchers felt it appropriate to amend the term minimal brain damage to minimal brain dysfunction. The formal name change to minimal brain dysfunction was made in 1966. Retaining the initials MBD reinforced an alphabet soup mentality that led to years of confusion about the meaning of the term. Somewhat ignored during this time was accumulating research indicating that one half to two-thirds of children with concentration and activity problems did not fit the MBT pattern. Since the label remained popular, children with learning disabilities, attention problems, dyslexia, behavior disorders, and hyperactivity were all at one time or another labeled MBD. Also, during the 1960s, researchers shifted the focus to look at the characteristics of the disorder rather than its causes. Using ingenious contraptions, affectionately called wiggle meters, studies were designed to measure what was assumed to be a excessive motion of these children. As hyperactivity crept innocuously into the jargon, new studies brought surprising results. These children do not necessarily move more than other children, but they do have difficulty controlling their motion in situations that require stillness. Though the results demanded another swing in motion focus, they did provide another piece of this puzzle. In the 1970s, Dr. Virginia Douglas and her colleagues at McGill University began demonstrating that it is difficult for hyperactive children to stop, look, and listen, to sustain attention, and to inhibit impulsivity. Others substantiated the notion that these children have problems controlling their behavior and adhering to rules. Furthermore, approximately 75% of the children were found to have additional learning disabilities. Probably the only thing that is clear to you by now is that through the years there has been great confusion and some ambiguity remains as professionals in the number of fields have attempted to define the significant characteristics of the condition. Naturally, This state of affairs has resulted in a wide variation in the professional advice proffered, making many educators and mental health specialists, as well as parents, uncomfortable. Attempts to disentangle the terminology came when the American Psychiatric Association APA instituted the use of terms related to observed behavior to identify particular problems. When you visit a psychologist or psychiatrist, he designates the diagnosis for the visit just as your family physician does. These descriptors are defined in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, which is the established diagnostic guide and reference tool used by the mental health professionals. In the second manual, DSM 2nd, published in 1968, the first term officially sanctioned for this collection of symptoms was hyperkinetic reaction of childhood hyperactivity. When the role of concentration was recognized as central to the child's problems, then the effects of attentional deficits on learning and social interaction were given their due attention in the terminology. Thus, in the third Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of APA, published in 1980, the complicated and somewhat clumsy label attention deficit disorder with or without hyperactivity was introduced. Not only was attention deficit disorder with or without hyperactivity quite a mouthful, but also in hindsight, it may have placed an undue emphasis on the attentional aspects of the disorder, downplaying the impulsiveness and activity control problems these youngsters have. Although there are children with attention deficits who are not overly active, this is not the typical case. So, again, a revision was made in DSM 3, DSM 3rd R, published in 1987. Attempting to deal with the variation in patterns of behavior, DSM 3rd R introduced the term attention deficit hyperactivity disorder ADHD and listed all the behaviors that characterize it. Since all children display one or all of these behaviors at some point in their lives, for a child to be diagnosed ADHD, eight or more of the symptoms, although varying in severity, must be noticeable for more than 6 months. Since ADHD is a developmental disorder, unless there is illness or injury, the onset of the symptoms must occur before a child is 7 years old. The behaviors include: first, restlessness, difficulty remaining seated when required to do so, easily distracted by extraneous stimuli, difficulty awaiting turn in games or group situations, often blurting out answers to questions before they have been completed, difficulty following instructions from others, difficulty sustaining attention in tasks or play activities, frequent shifts from one uncompleted activity to another, difficulty playing quietly, often talking excessively, often interrupting or intruding on others' games, often not seeming to listen to what is being said, often losing things, often engaging in physically dangerous activities without considering possible consequences. Based on this latest definition, what distinguishes the ADHD child from other children is the number of behaviors present, the length of time they continue, and the degree to which they are evident. A single behavior, such as losing things, is irritating but meaningless unless it happens much more regularly than it with your child's peers and coexists with many other of the critical behaviors. In addition, ADHD is not a condition that's present today and gone tomorrow. Although teachers are often the one to recognize the significance of the behaviors, clues must have been apparent for a long time. Regardless of the publicity, and notoriety the disorder has received. Only about 2% and at most 5% of the children in United States meet the criteria for ADHD set forth in DSM 3rd R. Based on these statistics, of every 100 students, it is likely that 2, 3, or maybe as many as 5 could meet the criteria that designates ADHD. If true, it is even more predictable that those youngsters will be male because approximately 9 times as many boys as girls are diagnosed ADHD. While there may not be hordes of ADHD children running around every neighborhood, when 2 of every 100 children have a particular set of problems, those numbers quickly add up. Everybody's pet theory. There are likely to be a multitude of questions that have invaded your thoughts and sleep as you wonder, why does my child have these problems? Is it something we did as parents that caused him to be this way? Could we have prevented it, or might we be contributing to it now? To alleviate your worst fears and to give you a summary of the best available information, we will answer the most frequent asked questions posed to us by parents of ADHD children. There are many pet theories, some more promising than others, about what causes ADHD, but just as the condition takes varying forms, several causes are likely. The research appears to be moving toward a growing consensus that ADHD has a biological base. Environmental conditions may play a role too, especially in individual cases. Next question comes, is it something we as parents did or did not do? You have probably overheard the whispered accusations. Why don't they do something about their child? An endless stream of comments from grandparents, teachers, and well meaning friends can send any parent into the gills. True, some of us are better behavior managers than others, but then some children are easier to parent than others. It is unlikely you are the cause of your child's behavior problems, but your child will indeed require more and difficult types of management than others. Many studies have been conducted to examine the interactions between mothers and their hyperactive children. Interactions between parent and child are reciprocal. Although you may strive to treat all your children the same, in reality, that notion is impractical. When children do not follow instructions, parents normally become more discretive, repeating repeating the commands several times in a row. When the demands are not followed, both sets of behavior may intensify. The parent resorts to stronger actions to gain compliance. Several research studies by Dr. Russell Barkley and Charles have shown that mothers of hyperactive children, probably as a result of their history of interactions, tend to become more negative, more directive, and less responsive to the positive actions of their children. When their children's behavior improves because of medication or other interventions, mothers having fewer negative interactions with their children become less directive. When interacting with a non hyperactive child, mothers of hyperactive children may be as positive as other mothers. At times, you know, doubt have been so tired and frustrated by your child's behavior that you have waited to give up, or perhaps you have blamed your child's behavior on your own inadequacies as a parent. Other parents experience the same feelings. You must remember ADHD is not a problem that can be totally cured, but as you will discover, many of the problems that accompany the disorder can be solved. Is it hereditary? Parents often have a striking reaction to a description of their child. That sounds like me. You are describing the way I was as a child. Or, after the last family reunion, you may have wondered if great uncle Malvin was the missing link. It has become increasingly clear that the similarity between parent and the child is not mere coincidence. Where children have been diagnosed as ADHD, retrospective studies searching the family histories of these individuals have found greater numbers of children and adults with behavioral characteristics of ADHD among family members. When the biological and adoptive families of ADHD children are compared, the correlation is between ADHD children and their biological families. A significantly greater number of ADHD biological siblings, for example, have the disorder that would be expected in the general population. The findings are most impressive if you consider that one-fourth of the biological parents of ADHD children, as opposed to only 4% of adoptive parents, also have histories of indicative of ADHD. While this research reflects a relatively small example of families, many of these cases do suggest a genetic component to ADHD. If there are other well defined cases of ADHD in your family, then there is reason to assume that your child's problems with restlessness and inattentiveness are inherited. Next question is: did it happen during birth? If there are no familiar connections to your child's behavior and he has a very difficult birth history, then it's more likely, but by no means certain, that parental or perinatal complications may have contributed to this condition. While some evidence exists that damage to the certain parts of the brain can lead to ADHD like symptoms, many children with documented brain damage do not exhibit these kinds of behaviors. In fact, in several studies of children diagnosed as ADHD, only 5 to 10% had histories verifying brain damage. During the next decade, newer forms of brain study, such as magnetic imaging, may still detect evidence of more subtle brain dysfunction if, in fact, birth factors do play a greater role in causing these symptoms. Is it caused by brain dysfunction? At least three different lines of research into brain inactivity appear to indicate a pattern of underactivity in certain areas of the brain that may explain why ADHD children show certain behaviors. The research that continues to accumulate suggests that ADHD children seem to have some kind of impairment of their function in the cortical or subcortical areas of the brain. Doctors doctors summarized the research on neurological factors related to ADHD in 1988. For example, there are indications that ADHD children have decreased blood flow to the frontal lobes of the brain, as indicated by decreased patterns of reactivity in their EEG wave patterns. More data stem from studies of the performance of ADHD children on neuropsychological tasks believed to be indicative of brain dysfunction. The last line of research involves the under-arousal of the central nervous system in the ADHD children. It has been hypothesized that cortical immaturity, as evidenced by encephalogram patterns, is the cause of inattention and impulsiveness. Conclusions from any of these areas of research are at best premature because the limited number of studies and problems in comparing methodology prevent generalizations. However, research in brain activity appears to be an important direction for the future and may in fact lead to better understanding of ADHD symptoms. Other question is it caused by something in our child's diet or environment? If you knew you could correct or control ADHD by not allowing your child to eat a particular food substance or by keeping him away from certain substances, you would cut the offending substance from his diet or environment, wouldn't you? A great deal of research and an even greater interest on the part of parents has focused on the role of sugar, food activities, and environmental toxins on the behavior of children. In 1975, Dr. Benjamin suggested that more than half of all ADHD children display the characteristic behaviors because of adverse reactions of food additives. He claimed that if the parents limited the child's ingestion of those elements, child's behavior would drastically improve. Many families tried this diet, but the results were mixed. Those whose children improved became wholehearted advocates of the diet. Despite individual reports, controlled research studies have not validated Feingold's thesis. The same is also true of the popularly held beliefs that ingestion of refined sugars is the cause of hyperactive behavior. While there may be some children whose behavior is affected by the ingestion of particular food substances, this cannot account for the vast majority of ADHD children. Exposure to toxins such as lead and nicotine or alcohol passed from mother to fetus during pregnancy have also come under increasing study in recent years and may account for some cases of ADHD. There are instances where certain anticonvulsant medications like phenobarbital and others have produced ADHD like symptoms. Although evidence links ADHD like symptoms to these substances, ultimately, understanding how these substances affect the individual biologically will be more meaningful. Next question is: was he just born this way? Some researchers say ADHD is not a dysfunctional or deficit in a child, but part of the normal variation among human beings, such as differences in intelligence or height. Theoretically, if the height of every 6-year-old child in the United States was measured and plotted on a graph, then the curve for heights would fall in a definite pattern, with most of the children appearing in the average range and a lesser number at the taller and shorter ends of the graph. Approximately 68% of the children's heights would cluster in the average range, but perhaps 2% of the children would be exceptionally short or extremely tall. Some people believe that ADHD is another example of natural variation, like those which account for height and weight, intelligence, or artistic and athletic ability. According to this point of view, a study of the population would find across individuals a range of temperaments and attention spans, such a distribution of traits and behaviors reflects human variation and normal development. According to this way of thinking, even though heredity plays a role, your child was just born that way. Your child's behavior represents various points on a continuum of possibilities. If you apply this approach in a typical classroom, most children will have an average attention span. There will be a few children who can concentrate all day long and not be distracted by anything short of bulldozer coming to the classroom. On the other end, on the other end of the continuum, there will be a few children whose attention span is so brief they are distracted by the color of the walls This point of view may explain why some children who have no family or work history suggesting ADHD are the way they are. In this chapter, we have attempted to clarify some of the issues and present a working definition of the term ADHD. Working is a key word. The greatest consensus about ADHD is that it represents a collection of symptoms and a range of behaviors. At the same time that your child may be very impulsive, have a short attention span, and be less active than his sibling, another child may be very distractible, highly inactive, and have a short attention span, yet both could fit the diagnosis of ADHD. While a label implies that everyone to whom it is implied that the is the same, keep in mind that such an idea is definitely not true of this disorder. Make no mistakes. No one should hear the label ADHD and assume he or she knows your child's particular set of symptoms or why he has them. You and the professional people who work with your family must define the specific characteristics that affect your child. Only then will you have the working definition you need to provide a treatment plan for your child. Your child's individual problems are more important than any label.